Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first Politics Today series brought to you by the GSA. My name is Margaret Mutumba, and I am the GSA Community Development Coordinator. So we're excited to bring you this series as an opportunity to open up dialogue about the Canadian governance structures, who are the key influential individuals in this area. We hope to have some of them come and speak to us. We want to understand how these governance structures influence our graduate experience and how we as graduate students can be more actively involved and participate and influence this space to see the things that we would like to be done in this area. So we hope to invite many influential speakers such as the mayors of Waterloo and Kitchener. We hope to host some of the Waterloo students who have been involved in politics in Canada and look at politics and environmental sustainability, as well as politics and the Indigenous actions that are taking place. We encourage you to invite your peers and your friends to participate in what we hope will be a lively, entertaining, relevant, and inspiring series. In today's series, which is titled The Introduction to the Canadian Governance Structure, we will be taken on a journey into the history and the background into how the Canadian governance structures have come to be. And to accomplish this, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is Matthew Rafuse, who's a second-year graduate student studying computer science here at the University of Waterloo. After becoming politically active in the run-up to the 2015 federal election, Matthew has cultivated a strong interest in both domestic and international politics, focusing mainly on Canada, the US, and the UK. Welcome to our first political series, Matthew. Take us away.
Thanks. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. So like I said, my name is Matthew. I'm a second year grad student covering CS. In my free time, I like arguing on the internet and learning about politics. So I was asked to give a presentation on the structure and function of the Canadian government. So, all right, let's take it away. So first, just a quick introduction as to what we'll be looking at over the course of this presentation. So we're going to start off with the foundation of Canada, dealing with the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada, confederation and independence, and what Canada looks like today. We're then going to move on to the government structure, looking at the three main branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And then we're going to move on finally to modern politics. We'll be looking at the federal parties and the provincial parties and basically how things are going currently. So just a quick disclaimer before I even start. The views on this slideshow are my own. While I tried to remove as much bias as possible, I'm only human and I only have so much expertise. I am a volunteer, but am a strong supporter of the New Democratic Party of Canada, and I hold strong beliefs surrounding their policies. So just to get that out of the way, just so you know where I stand politically. So first off, just a quick TLDR on Canada, 1867 to now. First, I'm going to discuss the relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada, and I'd like to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. So I acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the six nations that include 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. My apartment, where I'm giving this presentation from, is also located on the Haldimand Tract. So there's a lot to talk about on this issue, and I'm not remotely qualified to even begin to offer substantial discussion on this issue. But at the same time, I didn't want to give this presentation without any context as to the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. So the relationship between Indigenous communities in Canada has been defined mainly through various treaties signed between Indigenous bands and the Canadian government, along with the Indian Act of 1876. Ostensibly, the relationship between Indigenous nations and Canada is exactly that, one of nation to nation. In reality, this doesn't really tend to be the case. The Canadian government has treated Indigenous peoples abhorrently throughout our history. And even today, there's still a really long way to go towards reconciliation. We still see Indigenous issues coming to the forefront on the federal level and province level. So talking about confederation and independence. So Canada was officially formed. It was confederated on July 1st, 1867. It was originally 4 provinces, Upper and Lower Canada, which are now Ontario and Quebec, and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The UK Parliament passed the British North America Act 1867, which is what outlined the creation of a federal dominion from these 3 British colonies. But even though we were given we were ostensibly given independence in 1867, we weren't fully autonomous. We slowly grew, our autonomy was slowly expanded over the next century or so. First in 1931 with the Statute of Westminster. We continued to have provinces joining all the way up to 1949, and the territories were formed up until 1999 with the accession of none of it. But we achieved full independence from the United Kingdom with the patriation of our Constitution in 1982 with the passage of the Canada Act. There's still many throwbacks to British rule in our government, not least of which is the Queen Elizabeth II, our current monarch. So today, Canada takes after the UK in the form of Westminster-style parliamentary democracy. Westminster style is essentially just a way of saying that the procedures and rules that we follow mimic that of Westminster. We're a constitutional monarchy, so we technically have a queen, Queen Elizabeth II, although most powers are still delegated to the Prime Minister and the Canadian government. We're a federation comprised of 10 provinces and 3 territories. So the structure of the government. So the high-level structure of the government, it can be generally broken down into 3 separate branches. This is similar to many countries. The 3 branches are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So the executive branch is that of the head of state, the Prime Minister. In Canada, that is mainly formed by the Cabinet of Canada, which is the Prime Minister and their assistants and their ministers. The legislative branch is generally broken into the House of Commons, which is the lower chamber, the Senate, which is the upper chamber, and the monarch, which is our Governor General, essentially the Queen's representative in government. And finally, the last branch is the judicial branch. At a very high level, the judicial branch is particularly complex, so we'll be skimming over a lot of details, but in general, it's broken up into the superior courts, the courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court. So up first, a little caveat. The Queen is literally everywhere in our government. She's all over the place because so much of our traditions and our processes are inherited from the United Kingdom. She is all over the place. This is because technically our government derives all of its power from the monarch. In reality, the Queen is mostly symbolic, and her representatives are also mostly symbolic. So I'll be skimming over a lot of this, but if anyone has any questions about all the different places the Queen pops up, we can discuss it in depth afterwards. So first up is the executive branch and cabinet. So the Cabinet of Canada is the executive branch of the Canadian government. It acts mainly via orders in council issued by the Governor General, who is the Queen's representative. If you know anyone in government, it's likely one of these people. Some of the people you may know is the chair of the cabinet is the Prime Minister, so Justin Trudeau. He's that guy, the guy that everyone knows. Another one that some people may know is the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland. She also has quite a few other files that she is interested in. So the Cabinet of Canada has near total control over the legislative priorities of the government. There's some exceptions to this, such as opposition days or private members' bills, but in general, whoever forms government really guides the country over their rule, like for however long their term is. In general, with regards to cabinet, the power resides mainly within the Prime Minister, with other members taking orders from them. So while the Minister of Transport is in charge of, transport in Canada, the Prime Minister can tell them what to do. So each member of the cabinet is assigned a particular responsibility. They're called a minister. So we have the Minister of Indigenous Services, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Finance, et cetera, et cetera. There's around 30 or 40 different files. Files are what we call the different ministerial positions. And each one has someone that represents it. People can represent multiple different files. Once again, coming back to Chrystia Freeland, she simultaneously is both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance following the resignation of Bill Morneau earlier this year. Technically, the cabinet is a group of advisors to the monarch. So, the Queen's back. Hi, Queen. Nice to see you again. So yeah, like I said, she'll pop up all over the place. So moving on to the legislative branch. So the first and most important section of the legislative branch is the House of Commons. So this is the lower house of Parliament. It is comprised of 338 members of Parliament, or MPs, which are elected by first past the post in the different ridings around the country. Each one represents an electoral district, and our local MP is Bardish Chagger. So each of the 338 members will represent a certain geographical area. Everyone in that area votes for them, and then whoever has the most seats in Parliament generally forms government. There are two different types of government. There is a majority government and a minority government. A majority government would be if they have 170 seats, i.e. the majority of the seats or more. And the other type is a minority government where they don't have that number. This can look very different. What this ends up looking like is that politics looks very different when a majority government is in power and when a minority government is in power. Minority governments are generally less stable. There's more cooperation between different parties, whereas majority governments are generally a lot more stable. They tend to fill out their whole term, but there's not nearly as much cooperation between the parties. In general, the House of Commons, because it is the elected house, is the dominant chamber. We'll get into what this means in a second, but so this is where bills are introduced, read, debated, and voted on. So any bill that wants to become a law generally starts here, generally. So this is what the House of Commons looks like right now. We'll get into the exact parties and what they represent later, but to start off, in general, the Liberals in red have a large number of seats. The opposition, the official opposition, which is the second largest party, the Conservatives, has a fair number of seats. And then there's also the Bloc Québécois in light blue, the NDP in orange, the Greens in green, and two independents, which are the light gray. So the second part of the legislative branch is that of the Senate. So the Senate is the upper house of Parliament. It's comprised of 105 senators, which are appointed by the Governor General, the Queen's representative in Canada, on the advice of the Prime Minister. In the past, the Senate was in fact a partisan house. So there would be Liberal senators or Conservative senators, but recent reforms undertaken by Justin Trudeau after the 2015 election made it significantly more nonpartisan. So there isn't generally party affiliations anymore. However, Conservative senators were dragged kicking and screaming to reform, so there is still some Conservative senators. They generally oppose reforms for independence, and they want to keep the partisan look of the Senate. The reforms were mostly successful, though. I'll explain that in a second. So generally, now, the Senate doesn't act against the will of the House. Its role is mainly that of sober second thought. So the Senate can trace back its lineage to the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, which acts mainly as sober second thought for the UK Parliament. Originally, this was because when the House of Commons was first conceived of, the ruling class, the aristocrats, didn't want the commoners doing like really crazy stuff. They didn't want mob rule or whatever. So they had a second house that would be like, wait, just chill, House of Commons, like don't be crazy here. That has generally become not the case as countries have become more modern. So now it mostly just acts as a vessel for amendments and advice on changes to the bills instead of outright rejection. So you very rarely now will see a Senate, the Senate outright rejecting, refusing to bring up a bill brought on by the House of Commons. This is much less of a circus than the US Senate, whereas in the US Senate, because both houses are partisan, if we have a partisan divide in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, we can see absolute legislative gridlock, because the Senate just won't take up bills by the House, and the House won't pass bills starting in the Senate, and it's a gigantic disaster. We don't see that in Canada. Because the Senate is now nonpartisan, we don't see them holding up bills or otherwise causing gridlock like this. So this is what the Senate looks like. And as you can see, the colors don't match. And that's because there's no parties anymore, except for the Conservative Party. So the blue is the Conservative Party. They're the remnants of the Conservative senators appointed by Conservative prime ministers that didn't want to join into an independent or nonpartisan group of senators. The other ones are different. So the purple, the largest section, is the Independent Senators Group. And so this is not a party, but it's a group of senators, all independent with no party affiliation, whose only job is to provide recommendations on the bills and provide amendments. The only time that the Independent Senators Group is forced to work together is when it deals with the Senate itself. This is essentially as a check on future governments, i.e. Conservative governments, coming in and trying to roll back the reforms made by Trudeau by changing the rules of the Senate. The Independent Senators Group will reject such reforms, and they won't allow the Senate to be changed. So that's why we see, and because it's so large, any attempts at rolling back reform will not succeed anymore. There are a couple smaller independent groups, like there is the group of independent senators, I believe their name is, in the dark green in the top right. That is a mix of conservative and liberal centrist sort of senators that work together and weren't happy with the rules of the Independent Senators Group. And then in the bottom left, we have the brownish red, which was the Progressive Senators Group. So these are the more progressive wing of the Liberal senators when parties were abolished in the Senate. And finally, the monarch. So the Queen's back again. So before a bill can actually become law, it must receive royal assent, which is essentially a thumbs up or a thumbs down from the Queen, whether she approves of the law or not. The only problem is if she ever actually gave it a thumbs down, there would immediately be a revolution, and we'd be a republic and not a constitutional monarchy. So never once in the entire history of Canada has the Governor General ever not provided royal assent for a law. And also, as mentioned, I've been talking about the Governor General a lot. The reason why I talk about this is because the Queen is actually too busy being the Queen to provide any royal assent. So she appoints a representative for her, the Governor General. Because the Queen is the monarch of like 15 different countries, because the UK had a bunch of colonies, she can't exactly run around giving thumbs up and thumbs down to every law in every country. So what we see instead is that she appoints a representative. She's busy, like feeding her dogs and, I don't know, doing whatever we see on The Crown on Netflix. She's doing that stuff. So, the Governor General, in addition to this, has a bunch of other really important powers that they can only really use on the advice of the Prime Minister. So this includes stuff like appointing the senators that we see in the Senate, appointing Supreme Court justices. So that's an interesting note that's different from the US. Instead of senators needing to be confirmed by the Senate, instead of the Supreme Court needing to be confirmed by the Senate, it's just appointed by the Governor General. They also appoint lieutenant governors, which are the provincial representatives of the Crown. They can summon, prorogue, and dissolve Parliament, and provide royal assent. So the current Governor General is a woman named Julie Payette. She was previously an astronaut. There's been a little bit of controversy recently with her because of she apparently has been kind of rude to some of her employees, but I'm not really going to talk about that right now. That was a little bit further back. Now, onto the judicial branch. So before we actually get into the judicial branch, we're just going to take a quick side note. We're going to talk about Canada's constitution. So as mentioned, Canada didn't immediately get full power, full autonomy from the United Kingdom. It came over time. And this process was completed with the passage of the Constitution Act in 1982. This is what actually patriated the Canadian Constitution and set up a constitution of our own separate from that of the United Kingdom. The most important part of the Constitution Act is that of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the section of the Constitution that actually outlines the rights and the rights and responsibilities of Canadian citizens and those living in Canada. It's our Bill of Rights. So just some of the things that it talks about is it outlines equal rights for all Canadians. So freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, expression, freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association, all guaranteed under the Charter. Same thing with the right to vote, and it also outlines some of the specifics of legislatures. It also discusses, it also guarantees mobility rights for those who have trouble getting around. We assume it's what ensures that buildings remain accessible. It also guarantees the right to life, liberty, security of the person, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, arbitrary detention or imprisonment, habeas corpus, and presumption of any innocence, and other such legal rights. There's lots and lots more under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but these are the main thing. There are also sections in the Constitution, separate from the Charter, that detail Aboriginal and treaty rights, as well as equalization and equal opportunity. So affirmative action is actually written in and enshrined in Canada's Constitution. So where we see some constitutional battles in countries like the US over affirmative action, there is no such debate in Canada because it is enshrined in law. The Constitution and the Charter, by virtue of being the Constitution, are supreme. So laws cannot override the Constitution, except, interestingly, the notwithstanding clause. So the notwithstanding clause, or section 33 of the Constitution Act of 1982 says, I'm just going to quote here directly from the bill, Parliament or the legislature of a province may expressly declare in an act of Parliament or of the legislature, as the case may be, that the act or a provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision included in section 2 or section 7 to 15 of this charter. So what this allows provinces and the federal government to do is to enact temporary laws. They must be renewed every 5 years, that would otherwise contravene fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, etc., or would otherwise contravene our legal or equality rights. So this is obviously quite the nuclear option. It was a necessary inclusion into the Constitution to get buy-in from several important provinces and their governments, who saw the new Constitution as a massive expansion of the power of the courts, which it was, and limiting the power of the provinces to create laws as they see fit, which it also was. However, so in order to get buy-in, they added the notwithstanding clause. In reality, this hasn't been used that much. Quebec is a notable exception, and that for a while there, they were using the notwithstanding clause on literally every law they passed, just because they could, and to stick it to the federal government. They also use it a lot for their language rights. So ensuring the primacy of the French language in Quebec. That is mainly done using the notwithstanding clause. And there's a bunch of really interesting repercussions of the fact that the notwithstanding clause exists. It's a very interesting setup. It is, however, also subject to Section 1. So it has to be reasonable. So we won't be seeing the abolition of Parliament through the notwithstanding clause or anything like that. The Supreme Court does have some say over the use of the notwithstanding clause. So that's an important note. Anyway, onto the court system, what actually covers all of this. So this is a vast simplification. I've taken all of the judicial court system in Canada and put it in a single slide. So there's lots missing here. But just to give a broad overview, there are generally 3 levels of courts that we care about. The superior courts, which are the courts of general jurisdiction for stuff like civil lawsuits, torts, and criminal prosecutions. They also provide the ability to review decisions from lower courts, so stuff like traffic court and things like that. Like they will hear appeals from those from lower courts. The next level up, so if you appeal the decision of the superior court, you will go to the courts of appeal. So the courts of appeal hear appeals for cases decided by the superior courts. And then if you still don't like the ruling of the courts of appeal, you can appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, which is the final method. It is the supreme, all rulings are final, no more appeal court. Generally, they focus mainly on providing rulings on the constitutionality of various laws. So if you get a traffic ticket, you can't appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is mainly interested in clarifying sections of the Constitution and the constitutionality of various laws, on building up case law so that we get an idea of what our Constitution actually guarantees us. It also will occasionally provide other services, such as opinions on the constitutionality of proposals from the federal government. So instead of having to go through the whole lawsuit thing and then eventually getting them to strike down the law, the federal government can just go, hey, do you think this is cool? Do you think we can do this? Or is it like unconstitutional? And then the Supreme Court will tell them. Prior to this, another last vestige of the fact the UK once was controlling us was the fact that you could actually appeal from the Supreme Court of Canada to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the UK. This was the British Territorial Supreme Court of Appeal, but this stopped in 1949. So in 1949, they said, nah, we have no interest in listening to appeals about Canadian law, so we're just going to stop it at the Supreme Court. All right, on to modern politics. So, I include this section because while in understanding the structure and function of the government is all well and good, it's also very important to understand how it shapes modern politics. So in this section, we're going to look at the major federal and provincial parties and how things are going right now. So federal politics first. So the Canadian party system has 5 main elected parties on the federal level. This is surprising given the fact that we're a first past the post electoral system, but we'll leave that to the side for now, or for this entire presentation. So we have 5 main parties: the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the Bloc Québécois, the New Democratic Party, and the Green Party. But historically, only 2 parties have ever formed government: the Conservatives and the Liberals. That's not to say that the smaller parties haven't influenced haven't influenced the direction of Canada before. We'll get into that. So the big one, the Liberal Party, they are known as the natural governing party of Canada because in the 20th century, out of 100 years, they held power for 70 of them. They're generally considered centrist to center left. Their current leader is Justin Trudeau, who grew a sick beard over quarantine. I gotta respect it. Doing much better than I am. So kudos to him. They currently hold 157 seats in the House of Commons, which is 13 short of the majority. This was important for later. The Conservative Party is a big tent right-wing party, generally considered center-right to right-wing. Their current leader is Aaron O'Toole after Andrew Scheer stepped down after losing the 2019 election. They formed government from 2006 to 2015, and they actually held a majority from 2011 to 2015. Before that, they were a minority government. They currently form the official opposition, and they normally do. When the Liberals are in power, they normally do. So they hold 121 seats in the House of Commons as it stands. The Bloc Québécois, they are so if there's any anyone from Quebec listening, I'm very sorry if I'm wrong about this. Quebec politics are incredibly complex, but my understanding is that they're mainly a Quebec nationalist party. So they don't really care about federal politics. They just care about, well, they do, but only in how it affects Quebec. So they're mainly interested in making sure that Quebec is accurately represented on the federal stage. They don't really fit into the traditional left-right spectrum that we have, as they draw support from very different demographics in Quebec, from nationalist conservative rural Québécois to sections of organized labor. But in general, rural Quebec will vote with the Bloc Québécois, as opposed to in the rest of Canada, they normally vote with the Conservatives. Whereas urban Quebec will, in general, vote for the Liberals. This obviously changes quite a bit. Their current leader is Yves-François Blanchet, and they hold 32 seats in the House of Commons, which is, if you add that to the 157 seats that the Liberals have, is enough to have a functioning voting majority in the House of Commons. So they can help the Liberals pass legislation. The New Democratic Party. So the New Democratic Party traces its roots back to the CCF, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, and organized labor, so unions. They were originally a democratic socialist party, but they have since kind of tempered themselves and become more of a social democratic party. They're generally center left to left wing, and they're often called the party of conscience because they really have they have had an outsized impact on the direction in which Canada has gone. Many major Canadian policies can be traced back to the NDP or the CCF. In particular, national healthcare, like the public healthcare system that we are so proud of, was originally implemented in Saskatchewan by Tommy Douglas, who was a member of the NDP. I believe it was the CCF at the time, but he ended up founding the NDP. Their current leader is Jagmeet Singh, and they hold 24 seats in the House of Commons, which if you add that to the 157 the Liberals have, is once again a functioning voting majority. That's why our current minority is actually so stable, is because the Liberals only need support from a single party in order to pass any legislation, well, except the Greens. Whereas the Conservatives, and all the opposition, if they wanted to bring down the Liberals, would need support of every single party, once again, except the Greens. Speaking of the Greens, so the Greens are an environmentalist party. They have a strong focus on environmental policy, so climate change, dealing with that sort of thing, although they do have a relatively progressive agenda outside of that, very similar to that of the New Democratic Party. They have a relatively small footprint in the House of Commons. They're generally considered center left to left wing. My understanding of internal Green Party politics is that there's generally two main wings of the Green Party. There is the centrist, or the more centrist environmentalist side of things, which are kind of like liberals with a much stronger environmental platform. And then there's the socialist section of the Green Party. This is because, as I said, the NDP have become more of a social democratic party over time. The socialists in Canada kind of didn't really have a party to go to, so they've been trying to grow their influence in the Green Party. This was borne out in the recent leadership election. Annamie Paul is the current leader. They hold 3 seats in the House of Commons. During the election, though, it was mainly a socialist candidate going up against Annamie Paul, who was considered one of the centrist, center-left wing examples of the Green Party, and she ended up winning. So the socialists didn't really get the leader that they wanted. So how are things going right now? Well, I'm not sure if you guys have noticed, but there's a pandemic going on, and that has thrown a big wrench into things. So over the past year, we originally saw a lot of all-party unity going through the pandemic. A lot of fiscal policy, like CERB and the student benefit, all of that was passed with unanimous support from every party. It was really, really exciting to see. We needed unanimous support because they only had a couple people in Parliament who because of the whole pandemic thing, they didn't want a bunch of people crowded into a room. So they got a very small contingent who normally wouldn't be able to pass laws unless they had unanimous support, which is what they got. So we saw the Conservatives, the NDP, the Liberals, everyone came together and made sure we got through this pandemic all right. There was no infighting, there was no partisan politics. It was really impressive to see. And then all that fell apart. So recently, the Liberals and Trudeau and Bill Morneau, who was a member of the Liberal Party, may have had some questionable dealings with a charity. Their name is We Charity. If any of you guys went to like a Canadian elementary school, you probably heard of Free the Children. It's the same charity. They may have done something improper. It's kind of difficult to say. The We Charity has kind of like been in a bunch of controversies, some of which were related to Trudeau, some of which haven't been. It's a bit of a disaster right now. So the problem is that they are currently obstructing investigations into this however they can. So instead of trying to go for transparency and being honest about it, they are filibustering Liberal members of committees in the House of Commons have been filibustering it, making sure they can't get anything done. They recently made the whole issue an issue of confidence, which nearly brought us to an election a few weeks ago. The NDP had to stave off the federal election by working with the Liberals to pass their motion. They didn't really support it because it basically, instead of starting up a committee to look into and to investigate the whole We Charity scandal, they just delegated it to existing committees where the Liberals could successfully filibuster. Had the NDP not supported it, we'd be heading to election right now because it was considered a confidence motion. A confidence motion is basically when, it's basically the government saying, if this bill doesn't pass, it's clear the parliament has lost faith in the government and we should head to an election. So confidence motions are a big deal. And yeah, it passed, so no election. All of this is because the Liberals are currently extremely popular because of how they handled the pandemic. So because of this, they want to seize on this opportunity and call an election, try and get their majority back, which they lost in 2019. But they can't call an election themselves because no one wants an election. None of us want to go to the polls right now. So instead, they're trying to force the other parties to call the election so that they can blame this party on, like, these guys weren't working with us, blah, 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 so that they can, so they can have their election and hopefully get their majority back. So yeah, it's been a bit of a disaster. Everyone's kind of maneuvering around trying to get someone else to call an election, even though no one wants it. So yeah, super fun. Moving on to provincial politics. So I'm mostly going to talk about Ontario politics as it differs from the federal government. So most of what I've said can be applied to the provinces just on a slightly smaller scale. So the structure of the Ontario legislature varies from that of the federal government in a couple important ways. First of all, it's located in Toronto instead of Ottawa. But interestingly, their legislature is unicameral. So there's no upper house, there's no Senate. So there's only the legislative assembly. So instead of bills going from the legislature to the Senate to royal assent, they just skip the Senate entirely and go from the House straight to royal assent. Also, the royal representative is not the Governor General, but is in fact the Lieutenant Governor, who is a representative of the Crown appointed by the Governor General, who is a representative of the Crown. It's kind of confusing, but that's how it works. The Lieutenant Governor is appointed on the advice of the Premier of each province. So there's a Lieutenant Governor for every province. There's one for Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, etc. And whereas the Governor General is appointed based on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, the Premier gives the advice for the Lieutenant Governor. But in general, most of the stuff that I said about the federal government applies to the provincial government. So stuff like it's still a Westminster style democracy, that sort of thing. Just a quick TLDR on Ontario's political parties. So, and once again, instead of going through each of them, I'm just going to talk about how they differ from their federal counterparts. So the Ontario Progressive Conservatives, despite the name, are in fact more right-wing than their federal counterpart. This isn't always true. It's just currently under Doug Ford, they've been pulled in a very conservative direction as opposed to normal. Doug Ford is currently their leader. He's our premier. They hold a majority of the MPPs in the Ontario legislature, so they form a majority government. The current official opposition is that of the Ontario New Democratic Party, which is slightly more right-wing than their federal counterpart. They're fairly similar in policy to the Ontario Liberals, and they form the official opposition right now. This is due to a collapse in the Ontario Liberal Party, which was previously to the 2018 election generally considered more progressive than their federal counterpart. They're a little bit more center-left to left-wing. They held power for most of the 2000s before losing power in 2018. There's a rather amusing case where Ontario tends to elect the opposite of whoever's in power on the federal level. So if we have a conservative government in the federal level, which we did for most of the 2000s, you'll see a liberal government in the province, a liberal provincial government. And now it's swapped. Now there's a federal liberal government, but a conservative provincial government. It's kind of a fun thing that they tend to like doing. That also can be kind of generalized to all provinces, but it's especially true in Ontario. And then finally, the Ontario Green Party, which is a generally more centrist than their federal counterpart. Their leader, Mike Schreiner, is the only one that holds a seat in provincial parliament. They hold it from Guelph, so it's actually right next door. So yeah. As for how things are going, once again, COVID has thrown a huge wrench into things. Doug Ford really hasn't done a particularly good job of handling the public health response, as we've all seen, those of us who are currently in Ontario. He did all right in the beginning, especially when it came to delegating responsibility to some of the public health experts. But there's currently controversy over his decision to allow a Bible college to grant arts and science degrees, allowing it to become an actual university. The owner of whom is a close friend of Doug Ford and supports a number of really far-right events and personalities in the US. So there's a little bit of trouble there. Additionally, in the latest budget, they actually cut funding for long-term care homes, despite the fact that long-term care fatalities make up a large chunk of COVID-19 deaths in Ontario. And their current response to COVID-19 on many different levels has failed and is a complete disaster, with very little support coming from public health experts. The current system of yellow, orange, red, lockdown, different stages isn't generally supported by public health and is considered a little bit too weak. And their back to school initiative was not particularly well thought out. They kind of just reopened the schools with very few changes to adapt to COVID-19. So, yeah. So just in conclusion, the Canadian government is basically just this gigantic spaghetti mess of branches, houses, and organizations. I barely scratched the surface, not even talking about crown corporations, which is a very interesting topic. The general structure is pretty similar to any government, though. There's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. And there's a lot of marks all over our government of the fact that we used to be that we are part of the Commonwealth and were previously a subject of the United Kingdom. Though for the most part, this is now symbolic. So yeah, that's everything. I don't know if anyone has any questions for me. I'm happy to take them.
Hey folks, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Awesome. I'll ask you a question, Matthew, directly,
Sure.
as we wait for other ones.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who are not familiar with the Canadian system and want to learn more, what resources would you recommend them to stay up to date with news and information regarding the Canadian government and Canadian politics?
So in general, I'm a huge fan of podcasts. There's a number of them that I can recommend. So some of them are just normal like news podcasts, like the CBC podcast Front Burner is a short podcast that comes out every morning that just discusses stuff that may come up in the morning events. It's a very good podcast just for getting up to date on the news and what's going on in government. In addition, I'm a huge fan of the podcast Party Lines, also by the CBC. I really enjoy it because while they do a lot of discussions about the federal government and politics in Canada, they also talk, they have kind of a sideshow called Party in the USA, where they discuss the American politics, but from a Canadian perspective, which I think is something that is really, really useful. Yeah, so yeah, that's also really useful. What else is there?
Are there like certain like social media accounts or would you recommend people follow politicians online to see what their platforms are like? Like what would you recommend that way?
So if you do decide to follow individual politicians, like if you decide to follow, say, Justin Trudeau, I would suggest also following the other leaders, including, that of Aaron O'Toole, Jagmeet Singh, and the other ones, just to kind of get a more nuanced view of what people are seeing. It's something that I've tried to do. I recently stopped just because I'm really trying to distance myself from social media in general. So, but if you decide to take that route, I would just suggest that you don't limit yourself to a single party's representatives. I'd mainly suggest podcasts, but that's just because that's how I tend to look at this stuff. So there's also just just news sites, like keeping up to date with the CBC. The CBC in general does a pretty good job of keeping everyone up to date on what's going on in the federal government.
Matthew, that was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We have a Q&A question here. Does NDP believe in divide and rule politics?
So I don't really know what you mean by that, by divide and rule politics. Can you clarify?
Can you clarify? I would imagine, given that you shared that sometimes they work together with the Liberal Party to achieve certain goals that might be mutually beneficial, I guess what is their long-term strategy in terms of gaining power? Are they going to continue to partner with other parties, or
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I can talk to that. So I think that the NDP is kind of in a very strange pace where they are generally. Oh, looks like I got a clarification, but I'll still answer the question that you had first. So in general, the NDP doesn't really aim to expand its tent very much. When it does that, it tends to have to move to the center towards the Liberals. So we saw this in elections like the 2011 federal election, where the NDP became the official opposition. They had more success than they ever have before, and they did that mainly by appealing to a broader base. In general, for most of its life, the NDP has kind of been a niche party that mainly aims to use its small footprint in parliament to extremely strong effect in getting through policies that they care about. So yeah, they don't generally try to broaden their base. Although, of course, they're going to say they want to. They don't really back it up by becoming like more centrist. They're very not ideologically pure, but they tend to stand their ground on issues that they care about. So yeah, so there was a clarification. So dividing people based on same interest or religion and rule them. I don't really think, so the NDP I don't really think divides people based on the same interest or religion and rule them. No. I think they in general try to, the NDP are and their leader obviously being one of the few minority leaders, being one of the few minorities who lead a federal party, I do think they believe in multiculturalism and that sort of thing. I don't think that that's really specific to the NDP though. In general, I wouldn't say that they try and divide people based on their religion. No. Why don't we still have many female politicians? That's a great question. I don't know. It's definitely something that we've seen a lot. Like one of the biggest pushes under Justin Trudeau has been towards diversity in politics, and we saw an extreme focus, especially in 2015, on making sure that his cabinet generally reflected Canada. He had the first gender balanced cabinet in Canada. So I do think that this is something that the federal government really wants to work on, especially the Liberals really want to work on making sure that our federal government represents those, really represents those that they represent. Like we want our federal government to reflect Canada as a whole. So yeah.
Amazing. So Matthew, that was incredible. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was fantastic. And thank you so much to everybody joining in at this event at this time. I know people are busy and things are a bit rough out there. We hope you're staying safe. Just a heads up that this event was recorded, and we will be sharing the recording on our website, so you can see the slides there if you require them. If there are no more questions, I'll just say thank you, Matthew, again, for joining us on this event. The next #PoliticsToday event run by the GSA will be held in December. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.